Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Judy Kell-Hammond. I'm Director of Policy and Advice at the CLA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on applying for the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which is colloquially known as Nerf. I hope you will find this informative. We are running this webinar in partnership with the Natural Environment Readiness Fund, and I'm very grateful for today's speakers for giving us their time and their expertise. In today's session, we will hear from 4 speakers, and I wonder whether we could have the next slide, please, Caroline. Thank you. First up is Andy Slaney, who is the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund lead at the Environment Agency, and who will give us an overview of the scheme. Andy is a leading environmental partnership project expert using his broad knowledge of environmental issues to seek out mutually beneficial solutions. He adopts an entrepreneurial approach to piloting new ideas, focused on attracting investment to improve and protect our environment. He has over 20 years experience at the Environment Agency, working extensively in the fields of partnership working, grant funding, and green finance. Our second speaker is Helen Avery, who's the head of nature programs at the Green Finance Institute, and she's going to focus on the financial market aspects of the scheme. Helen oversees the Institute's work in mobilizing capital into nature and Green Finance Institute Hive. The Institute is involved, among other initiatives, in the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, for which the Institute is hosting the Secretariat. It supports the Environment Agency and DEFRA on the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, and it works with cross-sector stakeholders across the UK on unlocking barriers to finance for nature. Following Helen's presentation, we'll hear from Holly Story, who is the Head of Environment and Sustainability at GSC Grays, but will be speaking today on behalf of the Swinton Estate in Yorkshire. Holly specializes in environmental management, developing and delivering environmental initiatives for estates and farms across the north of England. These include agri-environment schemes and environmental reviews, as well as 3 ELM test and trial projects, a biodiversity credit scheme pilot, and a Nerf-funded project at Swinton Estate. So she's been quite busy. Having grown up on a family farm in North Yorkshire, Holly studied in Cambridge and worked for a charitable foundation in London before returning to the north. Holly joined GSC Grays as a farm business consultant after completing an MSc at Lancaster Environment Centre. Last but not least, we're delighted to welcome Adrian Dolby, who's the head of agriculture at Buccleuch Estate, who will be talking about Buccleuch's natural capital journey and thus give us an insight into what life might look like once a business is investment ready. Adrian is a member of Buccleuch's executive committee with responsibility for strategy and investment across a diverse portfolio of farms. Based in the Scottish borders, he advises the estates on agriculture and environment policy, alongside wider tenant engagement, and he chairs Buccleuch's Natural Capital Steering Group. Adrian is an advisor at both Astanor, a European private equity fund in the food and agri-tech sector, and the Goodwood Estate, situated within the South Downs National Park. He studied at the Royal Agricultural College. He is a fellow of the Institute of Agricultural Management and a trustee of the Tweed Forum. Before I hand over to our first speaker, let me quickly go through a few logistical details. So today's session will be recorded and it will be available on our website on demand in due course. Now, you might have spotted, if you're familiar with Zoom, the usual Q&A bar slide. Please feel free to use that to ask questions at any time during the presentations using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I will be putting your questions to our speakers after the presentations have finished. Now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Andy Slaney, who is Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund Lead at the Environment Agency. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Sorry, just trying to change the slide. There we go. Oops, apologies. Right. So just to put this in a bit of context, so both the government's 25-year environment plan and green finance strategy have set high expectations, the role that private sector investment will play in financing our environmental goals. However, traditionally, we've been looking towards government for funding, but increasingly we're seeing an appetite from investors to finance these actions. And so that's what we've been asked to look at, how we can bring new sources of funding to supplement those the government can provide. So going back, the government announced in its March 2020 budget that it would commit up to £10 million to stimulate this market, and the Nerf being a significant element of that promise. So fundamental to achieving that attraction of private finance is identifying how we can monetize the benefits of natural environment projects. So how do we create revenue streams, and in doing so, develop investable propositions? So the Nerf is trying to do this through funding the development, testing, and demonstration of natural environment business models, and helping you to set those up based on a sustainable financial return, whilst contributing to the goals of the 25-year environment plan. So how do we see revenue? We've seen examples of revenue coming from improving flood risk management activities on land, improving nutrient management, encouraging carbon sequestration. Oops, sorry, apologies. Sorry, this isn't going well. Here we go. Or creating natural habitat. So the green finance challenges we're looking to address relate to how we can take that recognition from just the value through natural capital through to monetization via payments, and can we create a market for things such as flood risk management or woodland creation. So in essence, we're looking at investment to drive the delivery of the benefits, and in doing so can generate repayment so that buyers can, so that we can repay that investment through the revenue that we generate from buyers of those services. So we had an initial round of the Nerf earlier this year. That was heavily oversubscribed. However, we did award funding to 29 projects. All of those were projects which were ones that provided us confidence they were going to succeed in producing replicable and scalable models. So ones that will generate and share learning in that process. So the fund is very much a learning fund. It's about developing those models and sharing that learning across the sector. So on this slide here, I've aggregated the primary revenue models of those projects together, just to try and create some form of order from the projects we have, although projects are obviously looking at various different sources of funding, so there's quite a lot of overlap. But broadly speaking, the projects that we funded in round one reflect the relative maturity of the existing markets. So there's quite a lot of focus on things like the carbon markets, principally around the woodland. However, there is some projects looking at peatland, but there's also an interest in the emerging biodiversity net gain offering, with some projects looking to innovate and push things a little bit further. So, what's the Nerf? I hope you've had a chance to look at our guidance. However, if not, it's published on the .gov website, and we've got some links to that later in the presentation. But at its core, the Nerf is a grant scheme. It's provided on a competitive basis. And Nerf is intended to support you to progress projects from those traditional models of delivery through grant funding to the point of having a compelling investment case and being ready to operate on repayable finance terms. But critical to all of these projects is that they need to do two things. They need to focus on protecting and enhancing the natural environment, but also at the same time generating revenue from an ecosystem service in order to attract and repay future investment. So Nerf funding is intended to supplement your own resources and help you through the project development stage. So it's intended to procure specialist advice and expertise you need. So it's technical assistance rather than helping you deliver projects on the ground. It's a revenue-based fund rather than a capital investment fund. Obviously, the exact needs very much vary from project to project, so we're trying not to be over prescriptive. But to date, we've seen a focus around things such as principally business development, but particularly things like financial modelling, revenue generation, quite a lot of focus around the associated legal support, and also more generally communications and engagement activities. So it's there to help you to design and structure a project so that it will generate revenue, not the provision of activities on the ground. And Helen will provide more detail on that in a few moments. We expect projects to be replicable. As I've said, if we're looking to support the establishment of the market, not by necessity just a few projects. So if proposals are relatively small, we also need to make sure that they're scalable in nature rather than just a small scale project. The geographical scope of this, due to the nature of working on behalf of DEFRA and the Environment Agency, is within England. However, we are able to support projects which cross the boundaries between Wales and Scotland, and we will be looking to provide funding based on the benefits provided to England. We're trying to be flexible, so we're looking to exclude as few organisations as possible. So as you can see on the slide, not-for-profit and public sector and private companies are eligible for this funding. The only sectors not able to apply are central government departments or non-departmental bodies such as ourselves. We're also looking to provide additional support through a community of practice to help projects. So we're not walking away on the provision of a grant. We're developing a community of individuals to support each other and also as a foundation for sharing that learning. Okay, so in order for us to assess projects, clearly we have a set of assessment criteria, and I think broadly speaking, it's critically important that you're able to demonstrate and ideally quantifiably how you're going to improve the environment, how you're going to protect and enhance the natural environment, supporting DEFRA's 25-year environment plan. But we also need, additionally for this scheme, very much for you to be able to understand the financial potential of your project. So what are you looking to do? How are you looking to generate revenue from an ecosystem service, or potentially cost savings, which can generate a return? You need to be able to understand your buyers and sellers. Have you engaged with them, or how have you engaged with them? And also to provide key support from stakeholders or critically beneficiaries who ultimately pay for this service. And also be able to represent your understanding of the market. What level of revenue do you expect to attract, or do you feel you have the potential to attract? We also additionally need to have confidence you can deliver the project. So we need to have clear delivery plans with costed value for money proposals, and various aspects around making sure that you've got monitoring plans in place. And of course, as I said earlier, very much being able to share learning across the sector. So the key facts for you at this point in time: we launched the second and final round of funding for the Nerf on the 8th of November. The window will be open until midday on the 3rd of February. We'll then assess projects, and we're looking, depending on how many apply, we're looking to award funding in June. Grants will be in the range of £10,000 to £100,000 per project. However, you are able to claim 100% of project costs. And we envisage projects typically to be in the duration of a year, but certainly not to go beyond the 31st of March 2024. So just finally, a couple of tips that we picked up from the round one and some pilot projects we ran. It's very important that you're as clear as possible about the environmental benefits you're expecting to create. It's very important to focus on understanding revenue, how you're going to turn your benefits into revenue, which are capable of repaying investment. You also need to spend time understanding your market, who are your buyers and what's their revenue stream. And also just to highlight, this fund, there isn't a pre-existing handbook for these projects and there isn't a route map. Everyone involved is trying to generate that at the moment. So it's highly likely that your approach will evolve over time. And it's just important to be adaptable and have a can-do attitude to this to make it work. So thank you for listening. I will now hand you over to Helen, who will provide you a bit more detail on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Just switching control, that's me. Good morning to everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm Head of Nature Programs at the Green Finance Institute. Our role in the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund is that we are an advisor, we're also a third-party assessor, particularly on the part that is about the potential of the proposed model to produce revenue that Andy just shared in the assessment criteria. We also developed the monitoring and evaluation plan for the Nerf. And what came from that was that there are some sort of key steps along the route to investment readiness that projects take. We spoke with the pilots of the ESME, EA and DEFRA pilots that you may know, the WIRE, Moors for Life, NFU, and the Cane Wetlands, and asked them how they were doing on that journey to investment readiness. And there tended to be these sort of 8 steps that each were looking at. It won't be the same for every project, I want to say that. This doesn't have to be in linear order, but I thought it might be helpful to just briefly walk through these so you can sort of understand, are you ready to apply to the Nerf and what you're going to be doing along that journey. So, for example, most of the projects that apply for the Nerf come in having underway steps 1, 2, and 3. So step 1, you'll have identified your ecosystem service. So Andy mentioned things like carbon credits, that's peatland or woodland, or nutrient trading, or natural flood management interventions, if that's what you're offering, or biodiversity net gain. You'll have a sense from your land or coastal area what you are going to be offering. You'll have also identified the sellers and the buyers, that's steps 2 and 3. You may not have fully worked with them yet, or certainly won't have got to the point of contracts yet, or you may have, but you'll know that who's going to be selling it. Maybe there are several sellers involved, and who's going to be buying it. Some of those beneficiaries that Andy mentioned earlier, like a local authority buying some natural flood management mitigation, or perhaps a corporate buyer buying carbon or peatland credits, for example. You'll have identified those. That's roughly where you'll come in at if you're looking at something like a project, different if you're thinking of a code or a trading platform, of course. And then the Nerf funding will help you work through the final steps. So number 4, identifying and agreeing a business case between the buyers and sellers, like in any business. Developing the legal governance and delivery plan. So possibly paying for legal advice, consultancy advice, in developing all the contracts. Just a reminder, you may have several ecosystem services that you're looking to sell, several sellers and several buyers. So the number of contracts can get quite overwhelming depending on your project. So you'll be working on those through the Nerf. And number 6, and maybe you'll have started on number 6 already, defining your intervention costs and the maintenance and the permanence of that intervention. There's a slight chance at this point that's you done. You might have a buyer or beneficiary who's prepared to say, I'll pay for you to put in the trees, restore the peatland, and I'll own the carbon at the end. It's quite rare that your buyer is also your upfront investor or the person giving you the capital. Typically what will happen then is your buyer will say, great, or several buyers will say, brilliant, we will buy the outcomes of your interventions, but now you need to go and finance those interventions. So then we move to sort of steps 7 and 8, where you would be developing that financial model, factoring in investment rates of return, for example, or loan repayments, and then identifying and working with the banks or investors along the way. And you may have already started those, but we thought this is sort of a helpful way of showing you whether you're ready and whether your project kind of fits in with the Nerf. If all that sounds quite daunting, there is a really solid community of practice around the Nerf. I'm just very briefly going to share with you. There we go. So for those in the Nerf, the successful grantees, there's a Teams, MS Teams, where they can all share how they're doing and share advice with one another. On the EA site, there's also the Nerf SharePoint, which has access for Nerf successful grantees, but also potential applicants. You can, for example, yourself, if you're interested, go and access that SharePoint now. There's videos of projects discussing how they're doing. There is several of these investment readiness preparatory, sorry, I can't say it, introductory, that might be better, sessions on there. There's documents that you might want to look through, and case studies and things like that to support the Nerf and getting those learnings out of the Nerf and out to the outside world. Ecosystems Knowledge Network, who you probably know, run by Bruce Howard, and ourselves at the GFI, specifically under GFI Hive, are supporting that community of practice. We're funded by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation to do so, and our role is to help any Nerf projects from our different standpoints. So obviously Bruce at EKN can provide advice for projects on things like how to handle contracts as they're looking at assessing some of the data and metrics, and we can provide support on how you might work with investors in the finance sector. And we're also taking the learnings from the Nerf and then putting those onto our individual platforms so that we can really get those learnings out there and across the UK, because not every project that gets Nerf funding is going to make it through. We appreciate that to the end. It's sort of a bit of a test and trial. We hope they do, and there's a stiff assessment to try and ensure that they do, and there's a lot of support to ensure that they do. But the shared learnings that come out of that are really invaluable, because even if it doesn't work, we'll understand quicker what didn't work so that we can sort of improve on that model for next time. So hopefully you'll feel supported, and I know Alison Baker's joining in the Q&A at the end, I believe, who can share a little bit more about the community practice if you need to. But that's it from me. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass over to Holly for a real life example of one of the Nerf round one projects.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to start off with just a very brief introduction to the estate for those of you who might not be familiar with Swinton. The estate is situated near Massam in Yorkshire, in Wensleydale, and it encompasses around 8,000 hectares of farmland, woodland and moorland, the majority of which is within the Nidderdale AONB, and there are a few protected designated sites there as well, including SSIs and scheduled monuments. It's a very mixed estate, and a key part of that mix is forestry. There are 711 hectares of the estate are currently under wood cover. GST Grays have worked with the estate for quite a number of years now. So when the Nerf application window first opened earlier this year, we thought it was something that had the potential to align really well with the estate's long-term objectives. One of those objectives is to increase the estate's woodland cover by half over the next 20 years. So that's 350 hectares new planting. We all know that as well as producing timber, woodlands have the potential to produce an amazing array of different benefits. And the estates have an ambition to follow a policy of sustainable long-term land management. And so as part of that, it was really key that the would be as multifunctional as possible and deliver as many benefits as possible. But balancing environmental outcomes and benefits with commercial interests, because it's not always straightforward. Planting and designing to optimize environmental outcomes can sometimes mean compromising timber yields or increased costs, so it might be costs of establishment or of management. And that presented a challenge because in order to justify the significant investment that we required to plant up this area, the returns from the new woodlands needed to be at least on a par with conventional commercial forestry and timber sales. This challenge is really at the root of our Nerf project, because what we're aiming to do is to secure new income streams from the sale of ecosystem services from our woodlands and combine that with the sale of timber. And by doing that, we hope to be able to produce a really attractive long-term business case for our functional woodlands, as we're calling them, which will underpin our planting programme on the estate, but we hope it will also provide an example other follow as well. So the project started in the late summer of this year, and most of the first few months have been taken up with baseline surveys of the potential planting sites. That's included an assessment of the biodiversity value of those sites using biodiversity metric 3.0, and it's also included a piece of work by a team called ICASP from Leeds University, who've been looking at the hotspots for sediment pollution and overland flow and flood risk on the estate. So we've used that information to try and optimise the location and design of the woodlands to achieve that balance between provisioning service of growing timber on the one hand and system services. I think it's fair to say that that's been a more challenging process than we'd perhaps anticipated, but it's been a very informative process as well. In the new year, we will go on to produce an assessment of ecosystem services that will be delivered by our woodlands and evaluation of those services. And we're focusing primarily carbon, biodiversity, water management, recreation, and of course timber. Finance for planting of these woodlands is going to be provided by the estate, so they're fulfilling the role of private investor in our. So the final output from the project is a business case presented to the Board of Trustees next July, hopefully approved. A key part of our project is also market research. We know that there is a developing market for ecosystem services nationally, but it's really important to the estate that the project delivers benefits for our region and our community as well. So we're exploring whether there is a regional market for ecosystem services. There's a lot of different factors at the moment that are driving that private interest in this area. So not only are we seeing the impact of climate change and environmental change locally, but I think there's also an increasing realisation that local projects and nature-based solutions can be a really key part of the solution to those global environmental challenges. So yes, our woodland planting will contribute to national targets for net zero and carbon sequestration, but it will also have a really key role in mitigating the effects of climate change locally and in providing social and health benefits for local communities as well. So we've formed a focus group of local businesses, and they'll be consulting with us regularly throughout the project to kind of test our assumptions and our valuations, and also to consider how we can best market our ecosystem services, so whether to bundle, stack them, for instance. So that's been a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through the project, but to finish up with, I'd like to just go through a few of my thoughts and experiences from the application process that we went through. It is slightly different in some ways this time round, and this is by no means official advice. So first of all, I think one of the reasons why we were able to produce a strong application for Swinton Estate was because we were starting off with a clearly defined goal, and we had a really clear idea of how the Nerf scheme was going to help us to achieve that. It's only a 12-month project, so you really have to hit the ground running. And I think if you don't have a clear picture of where you're going and what ecosystem services are that you're going to be delivering, then I'd say take a step back, think about what you're trying to achieve and whether Nerf is the right scheme to help you get there. The second thing I'd say, having learned from experience on this one, is make sure that the environmental impacts that you're describing, when you're asked to describe how your project will help to deliver the 25-year environment goals, make sure that thinking about ones that are specific to your project and your place, rather than just describing the benefits of wood planting generically. Third point on here might seem quite a simple question. What I'm trying to get across here is I think it's really useful to spend some time getting to grips with the terminology that the Nerf program uses, and that will really help you to clearly describe your, so knowing your investor, buyers and sellers. Might have seen the term beneficiary used, for instance, and just make sure that you have a really clear handle on those terms, and that will help you to communicate very clearly in your application that you want to develop. Project management, that's just a flag that you will have to demonstrate that you have resources, that you have people with the right skills and experience to be able to deliver the project effectively, and that you've thought about the processes that you need to put in place to do that. So make that part of your initial discussions and your planning prior to your application. And last but by no least, innovation. How is your project innovative? This fund does set out to attract bold and innovative projects, which is fantastic. But innovation doesn't have to be really complicated. It doesn't have to be reinventing the wheel. For our project challenges the established view, or perhaps traditional view of planning and delivering wood creation. Brings together some quite innovative ideas, but they are existing approaches and tools, and we're deploying them in a context which is that of a privately owned estate, and that's innovative. I hope that's been helpful. I really look forward to taking some questions at the end, and I'll pass over to Adrian now to talk about what it's been doing state. Much.
Holly, well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to join the CLA this morning. I'll just click the right buttons. So what I would like to do is just share a brief overview of Buccleuch's ongoing engagement in natural capital and how this is influencing our wider strategy in land use. So by early 2018, we acknowledged the rural economy was on the cusp of fundamental change as we gained sight of new UK policy in agriculture, the environment, and climate change mitigation. The catalyst for such legislation being the 2016 Paris Accord that formally recognised the importance of land use and land use change in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Buccleuch also in 2018 embarked on a strategic review of its agricultural holdings, appraising emerging risk that highlighted both opportunities and threats in primary agriculture. We identified land assets that currently have value and generate income, but in future may no longer have such capability. We assume future government support will in real terms decline, where in turn less productive land may concede its position as the primary function of land use to one aligned in the delivery of environmental goods and services that society increasingly demands. We concluded that if Buccleuch is to remain in agriculture, it would need to develop new expertise in environmental science and advances in technology that ensure our farms and estates are responsive to new opportunities in land use. Our response was to commission a survey of the 28,000 hectare Eskdale and Liddesdale estate in the Scottish borders. The work was split into two phases to evidence best practice in natural capital reporting and enhancement modelling. Latterly, we have completed a similar review in Northamptonshire, an entirely different landscape characterised by lowland arable and livestock farming, with plans for all estates covering some 80,000 hectares to be completed by 2022, noting these baseline surveys demand not only time and investment, but also the brightest minds in environmental science. So how did we approach this? The review established a set of 4 objectives to determine natural capital assets and their potential valuation. The first was to establish a robust and repeatable baseline, essentially an audit of natural assets and ecosystem services to understand more precisely what is held. This baseline is key to measure and understand future asset enhancement that may include important areas of wildlife or habitat providing protection against soil erosion and regulation of water flow, or carbon stored in topsoil and vegetation. Our second objective was to identify those opportunities with potential to enhance natural assets and their flow of services, to understand realistically those areas where permanent land use changes may occur. The third stage was to model changes to assets that could enhance their value through some bespoke valuation methodology. And the final output is an asset register providing an overview of important natural assets, identifying where to protect and enhance through changes in land management. So where is the opportunity? Whilst the survey of all estates is ongoing, our attention has now turned towards robust financial modelling using data sourced from the surveys to understand the potential for private sector collaboration. Latterly, we have drawn on Buccleuch's in-house expertise in finance, forestry and mapping to model through the Woodland Carbon Code our capabilities in native woodland planting, and more recently, a comprehensive survey of peatland assets and liabilities and associated biodiversity under the Peatland Code. But we also recognise our competencies in these emerging markets was limited, and therefore engaged our accountants with expertise in the North American carbon market through their Vancouver and London offices, in part to validate the modelling. So, for example, identifying appropriate buffer and fail rates in woodland planting, applying discount rates to predicted sequestration, and trading carbon units through defined timelines. It is apparent the sheer scale of the North American market that also highlights the inherent risk in agreements failing through pest and disease challenges, but also noting recent catastrophic fires in California and British Columbia. Such risk cannot be ignored, and hence it is essential we apply a gold standard in due diligence and compliance. It is becoming increasingly clear that changes in land use provide substantial opportunity for new revenue. Nevertheless, we believe it is unlikely the public purse will substantially fund sequestration of carbon, but more likely through private sector investment. Our observation with discussions with UK corporates and fund managers highlight a substantive commitment to reducing emissions, but also wider environment ambition driven by ESG values demanded by board and shareholder engagement. We note a burgeoning demand from investors wishing to deploy capital in land-based solutions, but also what appears to be a nascent supply of land underpinned by a credible baseline for alternative use. We believe it would be premature to engage in any longer-term agreement at this present time, but nevertheless, Buccleuch continues to evaluate how it may offer an investment portfolio that will include peatland restoration, native woodland, commercial forestry, and wider catchment services and biodiversity. Our starting point with these discussions is a clear understanding of financial objectives that include how we finance the needs of the business. What is the natural capital asset portfolio valued at today, underpinned by a baseline asset register? What is the likely value of asset enhancement, taking account of sensitivities on discount rate and carbon price? And what is the requirement in both CapEx and capital maintenance in new planting, regenerative agriculture, peatland restoration? Our experience suggests that all too often CapEx is substantial, particularly where land is naturally constrained. The portfolio will also consider forecast cash yield, noting revenue is more often challenged in the early and latter years, and the investment proposition. What is the return on investment of the proposed CapEx plan? What is the free cash flow and yield? And finally, governance. How do we maintain control within a portfolio? Who actually owns the carbon offset? Do we maintain management control and charge accordingly? And how do we protect our reputation? So to summarize, the passage of new UK legislation underpinned by the Paris Accord enables future land use to be a key element in delivering greenhouse gas mitigation, alongside biodiversity enhancement and catchment services, underpinned by what we acknowledge as a collaboration of science, finance, and land management. Thank you.
Adrian, thank you very much for this very useful presentation. We're now going to enter the Q&A session. So I'm going to ask all the speakers to come back on camera. And Caroline, if we can get rid of the slide, that'd be perfect. Thank you very much, right on cue. So we've had quite a few questions, mostly for Andy, unsurprisingly, about eligibility. So would you like to go through the questions that you've already answered, Andy, because they might be of interest to everybody?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So the first question was whether trusts and partnerships can apply, as I mainly talked about companies, etc. Broadly speaking, as long as you are a legal entity that we can enter into a contract with, then you should be able to apply. We'll obviously do various checks like due diligence, financial due diligence, things like that. But the broad concept is if we can contract with you, then you should be able to apply. The second question I answered was in relation to whether we could design and apply a green finance model or green bond type approach across a whole catchment, looking at the insurance value of assets. I think in theory that approach could work. I know some of my colleagues have been looking at this for a while. The Nerf is I just want to emphasize around protecting and improving the environment in line with the government's 25-year environment plan. So protections against natural hazards such as flooding are clearly within scope. However, we need to make sure that we can generate revenue based on that environmental improvement. As Adrian was just saying, ownership of those benefits across a whole catchment could be extremely complex and could be quite a time-consuming process. So I would just caution against thinking about the practicalities of negotiating with a huge number or a large number of individual landowners around the ownership of those benefits, but the concept is certainly eligible to apply. Another question, the final one, was just around woodland creation and pasture. These are exactly the sort of questions that we would like to test with the fund. Obviously, the carbon code is there for the sale of carbon from woodland, and I assume that the person making the question is involved in agriculture. Looking at how those two types of funding can blend together, and can they make an investment case for whatever purpose you need that capital investment. Those are the sort of questions that we would like to explore so that others can learn from how to make that work. So thank you. I don't know if others want to add to those answers.
Anybody has anything to add? No, in which case, let's go to the live questions. So a question, I'm afraid, another one for you, Andy. Will Nerf be available for properties already delivering environmental benefits, e.g. maintaining permanent pasture and woodland? And I assume that is part of either countryside stewardship or ELM. What's the answer to that?
It's quite a complex answer depending on quite exactly what the situation is. A project that is already delivering benefits, if the public sector is not paying for those benefits directly already, then you should be able to find some form of investment. However, if the government is already paying, then we start to enter the complexities around the rules of ELM or stewardship programs. Broadly speaking, we're looking not for maintenance, but it's around some form of activity that's new, what's changing, and how you're looking to be different from the way you are today. So this isn't about replacing sort of farming payments in any form whatsoever. This is about looking at providing investment to make protection or improvement activities.
Thank you. Another question is, so I guess this is for Holly this time, and potentially as well for Adrian. I'll go to Holly first. Did you use an external expert to help you write the application for Nerf?
I guess that's me.
Okay.
So that the estate brought in GSC Grays to, we manage the application process, and we're now delivering the project jointly with the state office team. So yeah, I think that was me working closely with Mark Lister and his team at the state office.
Thank you. Adrian, you didn't apply through the Nerf route, but how much use are you making of external experts?
We are certainly using expertise in environmental science. We have engaged with a company called Natural Capital Research, and they have been pivotal in guiding us in the baseline and the evaluation of those assets and how we can improve them going forwards. So they're comprehensive. A comprehensive piece of work that has very much built a firm foundation for us to take forwards.
Thank you. I have another question here on the Q&A list, which is in some ways a follow-up to this. It's still about baselining, etc., which is how much ground truthing is being done on the natural capital asset reports? Is there an opportunity to fund, I guess, from Nerf on the ground surveying and soil sampling to check the validity of aerial mapping? And is that one for you? Hi,
yeah, I think as Holly was saying in the work she's doing, there are essentially the Nerf is a grants pot to help you get to that stage of investment. So it's not restricted to you can't do X, you can't do Y. So if you need to do that ground truthing, that could be an eligible activity. However, I do want to point obviously that the funding that we're providing is capped. So you can't apply for over 100,000. It doesn't mean you can't use your own funding to do other things in parallel. And also the time limit. We have a Treasury deadline of the 31st of March 2024. You need to be at the point of completing your investable project, getting your project to investable state in that period of time. But yeah, ground truthing, natural capital assessments are eligible, but we do find that the projects that we funded generally had a relatively good understanding of what they were looking to do already.
Thank you, Andy. Helen, if I can follow up with you on that, what is, in your experience, investors' expectations about how precise and accurate the baseline is, and how much ground truthing has been done?
I always say that as long as you can find a buyer, then you have a product, and not all buyers require the same level of data. So I would say that. However, you obviously stand a much better chance if you've got the data there and the metrics that give the investor confidence. Just to give an example, I think I don't think I'm speaking out of turn on the wire, but it's very difficult, for example, in that case, to show that you are going to prevent future flooding. So investors do kind of have to take a bit of a punt, and that we think it's going to work out. You can't have exact modelling because various things change over that time. So strive to get as good as data as possible, but in the end, if you can find a buyer, it's a go, isn't it? So
thank you. And staying with you, Helen, we've got a question about the metrics. Do you think the metrics for quantifying gain, whether it be carbon, biodiversity, etc., will settle? At the moment, there seems to be a variety of metrics which could produce a different result when applied to the same area. What do you think?
I actually don't think that's one I can answer, unfortunately. I would think it's probably one more for perhaps DEFRA. Andy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one. I don't have any insight as to what will happen, unfortunately.
I think that's quite a difficult one. Could we take a commitment to reply back after the event? We'll make sure that we get a proper answer to that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, in terms of metrics, Adrian and Holly, what was the confidence of the estates needed to be in the metrics before you took the plunge and decided to actually try to get investment? Holly, do you want to start?
I'll start, yeah. So for us, obviously the metrics are better developed for some services in some areas than they are for others. So are going to be using the carbon metrics to look at carbon. I mentioned using the biodiversity metric. DEFRA have developed to look at biodiversity. Not perfect. They have limitations, and I'm sure that both of those will continue to evolve over time. And for other areas, it's more challenging. So recreation, for instance, we're going to be using the Orval tool to look at that. And on the water side, we're really lucky to be able to be working with ICASP, and that's benefit of the Nerf funding as well, to kind of bring in those specialists who have that at the forefront, if you like, of those metrics and modelling. So I think for us, it's about finding the best that's available at the moment and working with that, and then trying to future-proof that as much as we can by having access to the underlying data as well, so that, you know, if those metrics evolve, then we can try and move with that. The other part for us is this market research component, that if what we're doing is acceptable to the purchasing those ecosystem services to the buyers, then that's a huge step. So, you know, going to be talking to them about what they expect in terms of measurement, verification, requirements as we go forwards. So if you need to be working to a level that gives them confidence, and if they have that, that's a thing for us.
Okay, thank you. I saw plenty of nodding while Holly was talking. Adrian, do you want to add to that?
I would just add that the metrics are really key, and establishing any baseline for any land use change is absolutely fundamental. And I would suggest that it's viewed as an investment, because this will fundamentally underpin any private sector engagement that evolves in due course, and you'll be referring to this data for a considerable period of time. So it's important that you get it right. It's important that you have confidence in the people that you are dealing with. And I note from the first review that we did in 2019, as Holly has highlighted, the metrics are evolving, and how we will approach Queensbury Estate in 2022 will be slightly different to the way we approached the Eskdale and Liddesdale Estate in 2019. So this is a fast-moving space in terms of technology. It continues to evolve. We will ground sense check the data in certain areas. So, for example, we've just signed off on a comprehensive review of our peatland that will take 9 months with boots on the ground, evaluating the extent of those deep peatland deposits and the liability that lies within them. So it's an area that's moving rapidly, and but you have to start somewhere. But I would just reinforce the point that this should be seen as an investment in developing the very best data that you can establish.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left and lots of questions. So I'd be really grateful if panelists could keep their answers as concise as they can. Next question moves on to business model, and it's a question, I guess, for Andy. The fund is to help create a business model that is financially sustainable, and the grant to do so presumably is not repayable, it's a grant.
That's correct. It's a grant, so it's non-repayable on the assumption that you deliver your terms and conditions of the grant agreement. But yeah, it's non-repayable.
Fab, that was a quick answer. The next one is about scale, and that's a question I was going to ask because I hear a lot of questions such as the one that Edward posed about scale. So the case studies feature large estates. Is this relevant to smaller CLA members who are typically 100, 200 hectares? Does size matter?
Would you like me to do this?
Yes, please.
Just from the fund perspective, as we've said a few times, we're looking at scalable and replicable models. So the scale of the model that you use for your project doesn't affect the scoring as to whether you'd receive a grant. It's whether somebody else can replicate that or whether your model can be scaled up. So it should be replicable, should be applicable to all scales of project.
Thank you. Anybody wants to add anything on that? No. Let me go to the next question then, which is, I'm being approached to consider naturally regenerated woodland rather than entirely new planting. What do the panel think on this? Any interest in regenerative woodland? Is that something that would work? Andy?
There are a number of organisations looking at sort of things like carbon sequestration on naturally generated habitats. They're not at the stage that we're talking about where there are metrics that are agreed across the sector. Projects like that could be eligible. Generally, though, you would need to be performing some sort of activity to enable that to happen. So not just I walked away and therefore I get money from trees growing. There needs to be some kind of considered activity involved in that process, and those sort of activities are being considered.
Thank you.
Due to Kai, I might just jump in there and just suggest on GFI Hive, there's a couple of case studies. One is SLM Fund about continuous cover forestry. That's an interesting one to read on how you monetize that. And the other is Trees for Life, which has, reforestation, but also a regenerative model that it sells carbon credits on. So just to sort of point people to that might be helpful.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, that's very helpful. I have a question which I think would be quite quick to answer on, is it okay to include legal or IP costs, external consultants and academics? From the presentations that I've heard so far, I should imagine the answer is yes.
Yes, yes it is.
Great, thank you. So we're coming to the end of this event, so we'll probably have time for one more question. And I'll take a question on baseline systems, because I think that is something that I hear a lot about. There is a question somewhere which we won't have time to take, I suspect, for Adrian on what Buccleuch did in terms of surveying. And it's all about, in a way, jumping before you have 100% certainty. So the question is about, there are so many different baseline systems and each cannot be compared to the other. So how can you define your baseline against investor expectations if they recognize a different baseline system? What do we do given that there is no current standard for baselining? Is that something that, Helen, you want to comment on first?
Just really quickly, I would just echo what Holly said earlier about just doing the best you can of future-proofing as hard as you can, but that's all I would say on that.
Thank you. Adrian?
Well, I would just say that engaging with any external advice, you need to be absolutely confident in the capabilities of the people you're engaging with. And therefore, that is ultimately down to an individual business to apply that level of scrutiny. And there is no blueprint. It's who you feel confident with, but it is well worth spending the time and making sure you've got the right people aligned with your own business.
Thank you. And one final question. Holly and Adrian, how did you go about finding the relevant buyers or investors for your natural capital?
We are taking a longer term view where our time at this point is spent on ensuring that we have done the necessary due diligence. Those opportunities, they could happen today, but we don't think the time is right to pursue them for a variety of reasons. But at the moment, we are very much applying ourselves in developing what we believe is a very credible portfolio offering. That work is not complete yet, but we will take that forwards once we're satisfied that we have an accurate appraisal of what we are ultimately going to be offering on what will be a long-term contractual basis.
Holly?
Side, the investor is introducing that initial investment into the wood liquidation, that will be the estate, and then to sell the ecosystem services, as I said, we're focusing on the regional market. If we can make that work, that's part of what we're trying to explore through.
Okay, well, I think that we're now slightly overrun. So all that's left for me to do is to thank all the panelists today for giving us their time and insights. It was really good, and I hope it was useful to anybody who is considering putting in an application for Nerf to have this session today. And thank you for the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund for partnering with us on this. I will just remind everybody who is still online that the CLA offers members a wealth of information and advice on many aspects of natural capital. On our website, we've got 3 guidance notes, which are displayed now as if by magic. And there is a natural capital directory as well. So please do have a look and go through this. And of course, we are always there if you've got any questions, as are, I'm sure, the staff who are working on the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us again soon, and have a very good afternoon. Bye.